Welcome back to Every Other Carl. I'm Carl, and today I'm going to walk through the insulation process on my 10x16 shed. I'm using R13 insulation on the walls and R19 on the ceiling. I'm definitely not a professional at installing insulation. Read the comments. I'm sure there could be different opinions. There's tons of different opinions on insulation, and there's a lot of different ways to do it too. A lot of that stems from vapor barriers or vapor retarders. This is a craft-faced fiberglass bat insulation. So it has fiberglass on one side, and then it has this craft facing on the other side. And inside the craft facing is this coating, which actually makes it a vapor retarder. So it's not exactly a vapor barrier. If I wanted a vapor barrier, completely sealed vapor barrier, I would put up polyplastic. I'm not doing that for a couple of reasons. I don't think it's necessary here. I think even code doesn't say that it's necessary here. I'm in northern New Jersey, so we have a varying climate. I will be heating the inside of this shed at some points, which means that the inside of the shed is going to be the hot side. So condensation could form on this side of the insulation. That's why you have a vapor barrier. If you lived in a really humid climate and you're only going to be air conditioning the inside of the building, then condensation would form on the outside, which would be the warm side. Now we do have summers here and it does get humid. So there's house wrap on the outside of the wall sheathing, because in that situation, I'll be air conditioning the inside of the shed and the outside will be the warm side. So condensation would form on the outside of the sheathing. That's why I have that house wrap, which is going to help keep the condensation from hitting the wall sheathing and rotting the wood. In the winters, when we heat the inside, this is going to be the warm side. This craft facing is going to help retard the condensation from getting to the fiberglass, and wet fiberglass loses its R value, it loses its insulation value. It's also going to help keep that condensation from getting to the inside of the wall sheathing and rotting the wood. Some people will also argue that the fin of this craft facing should be unfolded and put over the stud, and then that creates a better vapor barrier. Perhaps. From everything that I've seen, that's not necessary or potentially not even the right way to do it. If you have a different opinion, go ahead and leave it in the comment section. Now, I know this is not a perfect install. I'm not a professional. This is not a permanent living space. It's not a tiny home. It's not a house. This is going to be used as a studio space. So all of that said, I think this is a pretty good job for the use that this little building is going to have. So this insulation is not just for thermal, for heat and cold. This is a huge part of the sound insulation as well. The reason I have R13 on the walls is because they're framed with 2x4s and R13 is thinner. The ceiling is framed with 2x6s, so that's a thicker space, and it has R19. Also, the majority of the heat loss in the building is out through the roof. So having thicker insulation is important on the roof. Part of this insulation process is installing baffles in the roof rafters, because I have a ridge vent, which runs the full length of the ridge of the roof. So those baffles allow air to run from the eave of the building, where I have soffit vents, to run up the inside of the roof sheathing and out that ridge vent. This craft insulation is also pretty budget friendly. It's typically, from my research, it's cheaper than doing the plastic faced insulation or unfaced insulation with a poly vapor barrier. And it's way cheaper than doing closed cell spray foam insulation, especially if you don't already have the tools for that. If you were to do closed cell spray foam insulation, you wouldn't have to worry about the vapor barrier, because that is a vapor barrier itself. Any gaps in the framing or on the windows, I'm spraying with just simple Loctite or Great Stuff spray foam insulation. I'm using the low expansion insulation because none of my gaps are really that big. And also, especially around windows and the door, you don't want the insulation to warp any of those window frames. When you're installing these bats, you don't want to compress it too much. The whole insulation value comes when it is actually fluffy. You don't want to compress it in. So if you have a smaller space like this one, you don't want to squeeze a large piece of insulation down and stick it in there. You want to cut it to the right size of that cavity. Whenever you have a small space like this, you can just take some of that loose fiberglass and just put it in there gently. So there's probably some arguments about this, but I'm leaving this nailing fin folded and stapling it to the inside of the studs instead of unfolding it and putting it over the outside. I think this is actually the right way to do it, but if you have a different opinion, please leave it in the comment section. Whenever you come to an outlet like this, you want to cut the insulation around it and stuff some fiberglass behind that box as well. You don't just want to bend it all the way around that box. Your goal in the insulation process is to eliminate gaps. So cutting it around here instead of squeezing it, you eliminate the chance of having an opening in your insulation on the corners of the box. As far as running the wires behind or in front of the insulation, I put them in front because I wanted to be able to access them in the future. This is probably not the best way to deal with electrical wires and the insulation. You definitely don't want to take the insulation and just press it up against the front of the wires, covering them. That's going to compress the fiberglass a little bit too much where the wires are, and it's going to potentially create an air pocket between the wires and the wall sheathing. For me, I wanted to leave my wires exposed just in case I wanted to change something up in the future. And I felt it was more valuable to have the fiberglass pressed straight against the wall sheathing instead of creating that potential air gap. I think the best way to deal with wires, and I did do this in a few areas, would be to take your insulation and make a slit. Something like that. And then you use that opening to go right over your wires, and it's going to hug the wires from both sides and close up on the back side. Again, if you have a preferred method for this, please leave a comment down below. When you're insulating with fiberglass bats like this, it's really important to wear gloves and a long sleeve shirt. A mask is really important, and also glasses. That fiberglass can get really itchy. It can really aggravate your throat and your lungs, and definitely your skin. There are other types of faced bat insulation like this that are not itchy. It's just going to cost a little bit more money. You're going to see me a few times in this video not wearing gloves or a mask. Just know I definitely got itchy after that. This was a bit of a complicated spot to insulate. I added some loose insulation behind the light switches and then cut pieces to fit all the open spaces and stapled them up the sides of my studs. I then went around and finished any of the open wall cavities, making sure to cut pieces down to size instead of squeezing the insulation into place. Alright, all the insulation is done down here on the lower walls, and it's time to move up to the ceiling. Alright, so now I'm going to add these baffles. They go right in between the ceiling rafters, and they allow for airflow to travel up underneath the roof sheathing and out at the ridge vent. I have a few different kinds of these baffles. They all do the same thing. They're just different brands. These are these pink styrofoam made by Owens and I have a couple others. I'll see how I feel with each of them, but they all basically do the same thing. These are very easy to install. Just staple them in place and make sure air has an unobstructed path from the eave up to the ridge. I bought 3 different types of these baffles since that was all my local Home Depot had left. These pink ones are called Rafter Mates by Owens and are by far my favorite. I also had to use yellow Duravent baffles. These were a bit more fragile, even though the cost was more. And then I had a couple black plastic ones by ADO Products. These were okay and maybe best suited for spots that require more flexibility. I used these around my Skylight. The way I framed the end walls of my barn-style building required me to add some extra studs to hold my insulation and eventually my drywall. I added those in at 16 inches on center while I was up here on the upper level. Once that was all done, I could work on the more complicated insulation around my Skylight. Alright, so I want some air to be able to travel up the sides and up to the ridge vent here. So I don't want to close off this area. So I'm building a casing for the Skylight. And this Skylight has this notch down in the side here on either side. And I want to try to use that. So I'm using some plywood and just using my router to router out a little bit on the edge here. And hopefully that will slot right in and come out to where my rafters are. That's a nice fit. Alright, so now there's going to be this channel in here that air can come up the side, and escape back into the exhaust baffle here and go up to the ridge vent. All right, now with this casing in place, air is going to come from the vent up the side of the window here behind this wood, and out the top of the casing and into the baffle to the ridge vent. And we have a little bit of insulation on the other side of that, just with some foam tape. It's the best I could come up with. All right, I made myself a nice substantial sill here out of this piece of 2x6. And I notched the corners here so that they can feed right in into this slot, tuck in nice and tight. All right, now I made a plate for the top. Pretty much the same thing in reverse. Notched out the back corners. I'm hammering it up and into place, and it'll tuck in tight. Here's my air channels. All right, I stapled that bottom baffle in. It kind of angles up so that air will be forced up into that vent up the side. And then I have this top baffle, which is pushing air back and into this top baffle. All right, and that's the completed rough window casing. With the skylight venting and all the ceiling baffles in place, my wife and I went ahead and installed all the R19 ceiling insulation. Similar to the walls, we just stapled it up along the sides and made sure not to push too hard so we didn't crush the baffles. Insulation is honestly a pretty time-consuming and difficult process, but it's very important if you want to make your shed a more usable space in different seasons. All right, that's going to do it for the insulation process. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them in the comments section. Like I said, I'm not a pro, but I'm sure other people who have a lot more experience with insulation can go ahead and comment down below too, and maybe help the next person out. There's a lot more coming on the shed build, so please subscribe. And if you like the video, like the video. Until next time, I'm Every Other Carl, and I'll see ya.